Well, thank you for being here. Last session of the day. I'm going to move this. It's going to sound bad. Okay. When Eddie approached David and I about doing a panel here, he said, you should come and give your paper on Houston because we're having this whole entire conference dedicated to Houston in the 60s. And I thought, oh, that's great. Like, I would go to a conference where everybody is studying the same city as me in the same time period, the 1960s. And then I saw the program, and it's the 1860s. But somehow this fits in. We might think of this as a long narrative about the experience of Houston. So I want to talk about the war on poverty. I want to start with a story that really caught my attention early in the research. On the morning of September 6, 1966, Houston resident C.E. Moore led a group of about 20 low-income residents into a Houston City Council meeting and demanded that city officials begin paying attention to the plight of their neighborhood. These residents came from an area of northeast Houston known as Settegast, a low-income neighborhood where housing conditions at the time were among the worst in the city. Several community organizers employed by the city's local War on Poverty agency also accompanied these residents into City Hall that day. These community organizers had begun working in Settegast earlier that year and had discovered the long-term neglect by city officials that had plagued the neighborhood for several years. So by the summer of 1966, community organizers and Settegast residents had decided to put some direct pressure on the mayor and other city council members to make improvements to the neighborhood. On that particular day in September, they had come to demand sanitary drinking water and a working sewage system. Through their own extensive research, War on Poverty workers had discovered open sewage ditches prevalent throughout Settegast, which contributed to an estimated rat population 3 times larger than the human population in the neighborhood. Yet the drinking water in Settegast was even more appalling. Nearly 70% of residents received their water from shallow wells that were often contaminated from septic tanks and sewage backups from outhouses. War on Poverty officials believed that the extraordinarily high rate of kidney and bladder diseases among Settegast residents was directly connected to the contaminated water they drank on a daily basis. So armed with that information, Settegast residents and War on Poverty community organizers demanded that Mayor Louis Welch and other city officials take immediate action to extend municipal water and sanitation services to their neighborhood. The strategy worked. Faced with this delicate political issue and clearly not wanting to appear to deny Houston residents sanitary drinking water, Mayor Welch and city council members immediately drew up a plan to extend city water services to the area, and municipal workers arrived in Settegast the very next day to begin the project. The event produced such a surprising victory that a local newspaper reporter covering the story summed it up this way: "The dawn of a quiet revolution may have broken over Houston when the Settegast group arrived at City Hall to begin receiving a redress of grievances that were a long time coming." Well, in addition to the more well-known components of the War on Poverty, such as the Head Start preschool program and the Job Corps training centers, this confrontation over sanitation services in Settegast was also typical of how local activists and poor residents implemented the War on Poverty all over the country. And just last year, I published a book about the War on Poverty in Houston in which I try to show this. Basically, that the War on Poverty did not operate in a vacuum. Rather, it was profoundly shaped by a diverse group of local actors that included public officials, local elites, grassroots anti-poverty activists, program administrators, federal volunteers, civil rights activists, and of course, the poor themselves. Yet what I show in the book is that the implementation of the War on Poverty in Houston reveals more than simply a national story with a local twist. As episodes like the conflict over sanitary water in Settegast show, the federal anti-poverty program often ignited open confrontations between activists, the poor, and political and social elites. Grassroots activists in Houston, if only for a short period of time, were able to use the war on poverty to advance an agenda of social change that included empowering the city's poor and helping them engage in confrontations with local elites. And in so doing, they contested mainstream definitions of democracy. These confrontations revealed a fundamental disagreement over what democracy meant, how far it should extend, and who should benefit from it. Many of the program's implementers took seriously the federal mandate to empower the poor as they pushed for a more participatory form of democracy that would include more citizens in the political, cultural, and economic life of the city. By the same token, the small victories that activists were able to achieve in their quest to expand democracy provoked a strong backlash from local public officials and defenders of the status quo. In Houston, therefore, the war on poverty simultaneously created opportunities for grassroots activists to bring about social change and set limits on what those activists could ultimately achieve. See, in this new light, the implementation of the war on poverty revealed both the possibilities and the limits of American democracy in the 1960s. So the history of the war on poverty in Houston is filled with instances of activists using the federal program to expand the meaning of democracy. One of those is depicted here in this photo that I've chosen to show you for this presentation, one that I'm not going to talk too much about in my presentation, but one that I found interesting. This is in the Sunnyside neighborhood, if you know where that is, south of the 610 Loop on the south side. War on poverty organizers had been working in Sunnyside for a few months when they recognized that the poor themselves in that neighborhood had come up with a very valid critique of developers coming in and basically building slum housing in Sunnyside. And so this is a protest against that, and you can see from some of their signs, don't support slum landlords. So this is yet another way that activists help to implement the war on poverty in the city of Houston. So what I want to do is call your attention to two additional examples from the Settegast neighborhood that illustrate my broader argument about democracy. After achieving some success in getting city officials to address the problem of contaminated water in Settegast, neighborhood residents and war on poverty organizers focused on the absence of medical treatment facilities. Community organizers were shocked to discover that there were no healthcare facilities in Settegast or in any of the surrounding communities. There was not a single doctor or dentist who practiced in the area, and if residents needed medical attention, they had to travel 13 miles to Ben Taub Hospital in the Texas Medical Center, which was the nearest public health facility to the Settegast community. At least that was the nearest public health facility that anyone wanted to go to. Of course, Jefferson Davis Hospital was in existence at the time, but if you've read Yonda Hartog's book, you know that if you wanted to live, you didn't go to Jeff Davis Hospital. Well, many residents lacked the means of transporting themselves or family members to the hospital. And of course, since ambulance services were only available to those who could pay for them at the time, most Settegast residents simply received no medical attention when they were sick or injured. So as organizers and residents began putting pressure on the Harris County Hospital District to build and maintain a permanent branch of the public hospital system in Settegast, district officials responded slowly but generally favorably to the idea. By early January 1967, the Hospital District Board had placed the issue on the agenda for their meeting that month. Well, during this Hospital District Board meeting to vote on the proposed clinic in Settegast, community organizers and neighborhood residents marched to City Hall to demand that board members approve the plan. And once again, the strategy worked. The hospital district voted to establish a branch of the Charity Hospital in Settegast immediately. Located inside a building donated by the Houston City Council, the new Settegast Clinic opened during the last week in January and served 175 poor residents in its first week of operation. Community organizers and poor residents had also achieved a long-term victory. The Settegast Clinic was in fact just the first neighborhood clinic opened by the Harris County Hospital District. Over the next decade, nearly every low-income neighborhood in Houston saw a clinic open close to them. The same month the Settegast Clinic opened its doors, community organizers discovered that Settegast residents themselves had developed a critique of devious mortgage lending practices prevalent in their neighborhood and how these methods were sometimes linked to police brutality. On January 6, 1967, a deputy constable appeared at the doorstep of Settegast resident Betty Gentry, who was 8 months pregnant, to carry out an eviction order. The deputy constable ordered Gentry out of her home and began removing her belongings. When Gentry's plea that she had been wrongly evicted went unheeded, she began making a telephone call to her mortgage lender. At that point, the confrontation turned physical. When I was on the phone, Gentry recalled, one of the men pushed me. I hit him with the phone to defend myself. He then threw me by the hair into the bedroom and handcuffed me and threw me across the bed. After the eviction, the deputy constable arrested her and charged her with aggravated assault. A few hours later, as news of the altercation spread throughout the neighborhood, several hundred angry Settegast residents showed up at Gentry's home and staged a spontaneous protest that lasted until the early morning hours the next day. Well, according to Reverend Earl Allen, a longtime Houston civil rights activist and the War on Poverty's chief community organizer in Settegast, the treatment of Betty Gentry illustrated two of the most glaring inequalities poor people faced in Houston. The first was police brutality. The second was a devious mortgage lending practice known as a contract for deed arrangement. Mortgage lenders in Settegast had devised a plan, common in poor neighborhoods across the country, whereby a prospective homebuyer was allowed to make installment payments each month toward a down payment, after which the homeowner could receive a regular mortgage loan. Although this practice seemed to enable poor people to buy homes when they could not otherwise afford to make a full down payment, Allen's staff found that many of these contracts contained exorbitant hidden fees and finance charges that trapped poor buyers in a deepening cycle of debt. Ultimately, many ended up losing their homes and all of the money they had already paid. Well, more than 2,000 Settegast residents, including Earl Allen and his staff, met at a local Baptist church the evening following the incident at Gentry's home. They signed a petition calling for the immediate dismissal of the deputy constable who had mistreated Gentry and vowed to protest at City Hall until their demand was answered. Earl Allen later explained that in his view, quote, eviction wasn't the real issue. The real issues are lack of adequate housing, which permits profiteers to insist on unfair terms, and the intimidation of the poor by police. Allen and his community organizing staff vowed to help residents stage demonstrations outside city and county offices until they forced public officials to respond to their concerns. Well, approximately 80 Settegast residents boarded buses a few days after the Gentry incident and headed into downtown Houston. Though the protest did not result in the dismissal of the deputy constable, it did force a response from city and county officials. Precinct 1 Constable W.H. Rankin, the deputy constable's immediate supervisor, told the protesters that Gentry was, quote, agitated during the eviction proceedings, and at some point during the scuffle, she struck the deputy constable. We can't allow our men to be beaten and abused, argued Rankin. We only serve the papers after the court has decided on the eviction. Well, the constable, in fact, had raised an important point. Betty Gentry was not simply roughed up by one county constable. According to Earl Allen, she was the victim of a web of oppression that included unscrupulous profiteers, local city ordinances, the courts, and law enforcement officials. Protesting the treatment of Gentry was simply a way to confront the structural and institutional obstacles facing Settegast residents and to demand a voice in how municipal officials carried out policies that impacted their lives directly. Well, these experiences in Settegast were just a few examples of how the War on Poverty opened a window of opportunity for local activists to expand the meaning of democracy to include the voices of poor residents in the decisions that affected their lives. And as you might expect, Houston's public officials viewed these attempts to expand democracy as unsettling, and their response indicated just how seriously they interpreted this threat to their power. Beginning in February 1967, Mayor Louis Welch, Police Chief Herman Short, and a recently elected United States Congressman from Houston named George Bush launched a concerted assault on this effort to use the War on Poverty to empower the poor in the city. The three public officials attacked the local War on Poverty's voter registration drives in Houston, tried to link anti-poverty volunteers with the riot that occurred on the campus of Texas Southern University in May 1967, and repeatedly demanded that federal program administrators get control of their workers in Houston. At the same time, by 1967, a more cautious mood had overtaken federal war on poverty officials in Washington, and this had a tremendous effect on the local implementation in Houston. If there's time afterwards for questions and answers, I'd be happy to talk more about the specific actions Houston's public officials took. But my main point here is that the mayor and others took these challenges to their authority very seriously, and their response revealed a fundamental disagreement about the meaning of democracy. So what was the result of this conflict over democracy? Was there an expansion of democracy for Houston's poor residents? Well, as its implementation in Houston reveals, there certainly were opportunities to expand the meaning of democracy using the war on poverty. The federal anti-poverty program opened up a space, what theorists Harry Boyd and Sarah Evans have termed a free space, to challenge mainstream definitions of democracy. Together with civil rights legislation, for a few years, the federal government placed its power and authority behind the idea of broadening democracy, and a significant number of grassroots activists capitalized on these opportunities to change the status quo. Yet once activists and poor Houston residents began achieving a few victories, local public officials organized to preserve a more limited interpretation of democracy. In the end, it was this more limited vision that prevailed over the more participatory form of democracy advocated for by local activists. Specifically, the type of democracy that survived would have a place for racial minorities, women, and even the poor to take part in a system of representative democracy through voting and office holding, but these groups would not necessarily be permitted to participate directly in the decision-making processes that affected their daily lives. And this significant limitation applied especially to those living in poverty, as gains made in enlarging the number of Americans who could take part in electoral politics primarily benefited the middle class. More importantly, this episode in Houston's recent history reveals several important lessons about the nature of American democracy and how ordinary citizens engage in the democratic process. First, the political conflicts in Houston during these years show that democracy itself is inherently unstable. It is constantly being renegotiated and redefined. Second, this episode reveals that democracy does not inevitably expand, right? There is no progressive march toward perfect democracy. Rather, any expansion of democracy requires conflict and struggle. Finally, democracy and power are inextricably intertwined and must be understood together. There can be no broadening of democracy without an exercise and display of power. The experiences of local activists in Houston as they struggled to use the war on poverty to expand the meaning of democracy did indeed leave behind an important legacy in Houston. The extension of water and sanitation services to remote low-income neighborhoods like Settegast began a process of equalizing municipal amenities across the entire city. The opening of the Settegast Clinic was only the first establishment of a public health care facility in one of Houston's poor neighborhoods. Today, the Harris County Hospital District operates 3 hospitals, 15 community health clinics, 9 school-based facilities, a dialysis center, and several mobile health clinics. The Gulf Coast Community Services Association continues to operate several service programs in Houston's low-income neighborhoods, including housing assistance, a food pantry, a clothes closet, employment skills training, and of course, the very popular Head Start preschool program. In conjunction with the civil rights movements in the city, the voter registration drives initiated by war on poverty activists changed the face of electoral politics in Houston. So while it is clear that a previous generation of historians overlooked many of these lasting consequences of President Johnson's anti-poverty efforts, the question of whether the war on poverty actually expanded democracy and empowered the poor in the long term is a more complicated matter and much more difficult to answer definitively. Although there was a significant number of grassroots activists and poor residents who attempted to use the war on poverty to expand democracy, a more significant long-term consequence of these endeavors was the effort to maintain a more limited interpretation of democracy. In Houston, the successes activists were able to achieve provoked a strong backlash from pillars of local power, and this counterattack was ultimately fatal for the building of a strong social movement capable of continuing the march toward a fuller interpretation of democracy. Houston's experience with the war on poverty also reveals a broader insight into the nature of American politics. The face of democracy in America certainly looked different after the upheavals of the 1960s. As many historians have shown, federal legislation passed in response to various civil rights and women's movements has resulted in a more inclusive political arena where there is now a remarkable amount of voting and office holding among women and racial minorities, although I think we could argue that some of that is being scaled back today. Yet while the realm of politics has become more accessible since the 1960s, the broader definition of democracy, including what democracy actually means in the lives of most Americans, remains for the most part unchanged. More American citizens have been brought into the mainstream political process, but the process itself emerged from the 1960s relatively unaltered. As the backlash against the war on poverty shows, the idea of participatory democracy, where all citizens, however poor, would participate directly in the decision-making processes that affect their lives, went down in defeat. It is the limited interpretation of democracy, the one favored by most elites in Houston and across the nation, that ultimately prevailed and persists to the current day. So I'll conclude my talk today by making an argument for the value of using history as a tool for understanding the complex world in which we live. As other historians have argued, in our present age of empire, globalization, and the export of American democracy, it is particularly important to re-examine the historically contradictory and exclusionary development of democracy within the United States itself. The implementation of the war on poverty in Houston, especially what those experiences reveal about the relationship between democracy and power, suggests that democracy is perpetually in crisis. Yet that crisis is not something to lament. Instead, it should compel us to attempt to understand the concept of democracy more deeply, especially because most Americans agree that democracy is an experiment we want to be a part of. Democracy itself is inherently unstable, open to interpretation, and inextricably tied to power. Any expansion of democracy requires struggle, conflict, and even crisis. Democracy is constantly being redefined, renegotiated, and reimagined. And scholars who study democracy should make every attempt to engage a broader public, if for no other reason than to convince that public of the complex nature of democracy. Thank you.
On May 15th, 1969, African-American, Mexican-American, and Anglo-Baptist pastors in the Houston area gathered for the first meeting of the Harris County Baptist Ministers Fellowship. They called this an inspirational and fellowship body meeting for the purpose of discussing denominational and community problems of Christian concern and striving to arrive at common solutions. Speakers at these monthly meetings urged pastors in attendance that they had a duty to bring these social issues before their congregations, arguing that church leaders had a responsibility to move their congregations into action if there was to be any hope of positive change. As the Reverend F.N. Williams, longtime pastor of Antioch Baptist Church, put it at a 1971 meeting, if you're going to have clean clothes, you have to put an agitator in the washing machine. Jesus told us to agitate situations to make the world better. So members of the fellowship engaged issues of racism along with other problems relevant to the areas surrounding local church bodies. In the first 2 years of the fellowship's activities, Odom Dias, chairman of the Union Baptist Association Negro Ministries Committee, reported that African American, Anglo, and Latino pastors in the Houston County Baptist Ministers Fellowship had led their churches to participate in a pulpit exchange program called Race Relations Sundays. Now, these exchange programs were intended to foster what they called interracial understanding, sort of a vague goal, but it was a place to start. Although Dias underscored how successful the event had been for those who participated and how much African American and Mexican American pastors were involved, he also lamented, "We cannot help but observe that the participation of the Anglo pastors in these activities is minimal." So notwithstanding the waning participation by Anglo-Baptists, what made an organization like the Harris County Baptist Ministers Fellowship even possible were the long-term concerted efforts of Black, brown, and white Baptists interested in addressing the racial climate in Houston. Those efforts led to more collaboration among diverse Baptists and kept pressure on Anglo-Baptist leaders determined to resist. More importantly, though, as different pastors encountered the rising tide of political and social tension characteristic of the 1950s and 60s, the long civil rights movement opened a space within religious communities to challenge the racial status quo through collaborative avenues like the Interracial Fellowship. Focusing primarily on three influential Baptist leaders in the Houston area, William A. Lawson, K. Owen White, and James L. Navarro, I hope to join an ongoing conversation about the intersections of race and religion and African American and Mexican American civil rights movements in Houston. My focus on these three groups, and Baptists they are, in civil rights activism addresses two significant gaps in the way historians talk about the civil rights movement. So compared to the literature on religion and the Black freedom struggle, which still deserves more attention, the paucity of religion-focused works in Mexican American civil rights historiography is striking. Second, historical discussions of these movements tend to treat them separately, even though they often occurred at the same time in the same places. Recent scholarship, of course, has attempted to address this gap, but it tends to emphasize conflict between African American and Mexican American groups. Instead of focusing on the success or failure of a presumed alliance among Black and brown Houstonians, I try to highlight their juxtaposition and their coexistence. In the pages that follow, I explore how religious identity politics influenced African American, Anglo, and Mexican American Baptists differently as they encountered, engaged in, and reacted to the struggle for civil rights in Houston through religious avenues. So I'm starting with William A. Lawson, Bill Lawson. He's known for his steady leadership in the civil rights movement in Houston. In interviews that are recorded and available in many places, he talks about his arrival in Houston. He came to the Bayou City in 1955 to take over the position of Baptist Student Union Director at TSU, as well as being a professor of Bible. In the BSU at Texas Southern is actually a Baptist General Convention of Texas-sponsored student ministry. The Baptist General Convention of Texas is, of course, a statewide Baptist body, and it's also represented one of the most cooperative interracial efforts the statewide convention had attempted. But even though Union Baptist still had not accepted Black Baptist churches into their fellowship, they were ironically supporting Lawson's salary at the BSU activities at TSU. So, as Lawson himself points out, in 1955, he arrives in Houston the same year that Emmett Till was murdered and at the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott. So he's arriving right as sort of the clouds of the storm are forming. Lawson eventually encountered the effects of these changes head-on in 1960. When TSU students asked for help as they prepared their own sit-in movement to desegregate the Bayou City. Of course, scholars and activists have devoted increasing attention to the story of the student sit-ins that began at Weingarten's lunch counter and Lawson's initial apprehension about the idea. This movement, though, highlights how the civil rights movement moved Lawson into the movement and created an opportunity for him to begin funneling the religious resources at his disposal into leading campaigns for racial equality. A group of students initially approached Lawson in March of 1960 and asked him to guide them in their attempts to lead a sit-in movement in the Bayou City like those that had begun in Greensboro. Lawson initially tried to discourage the students, arguing that their parents had not pulled themselves out of poverty and sent their children to school to see them arrested for causing a disturbance. Lawson quickly discerned that the students were determined to act with or without him. The famous sort of quote is, well, Mr. Lawson, we didn't come here to ask for your permission, we came to ask for your help. And if you're not going to give us help, we'll find someone who will. He eventually stepped in as a sponsor of the sit-in movement, led by the TSU students. Once the students were jailed for sitting at the segregated lunch counter in Weingarten Supermarket and other locations later on, Lawson and his wife Audrey went door-to-door raising bail money. They hosted poster-making parties at the BSU building and began to offer advice and counsel for the growing movement. Ironically enough, this meant that the still segregated Union Baptist Association was indirectly funding and supporting the sit-in movement through financing Lawson's salary and his work at the BSU, something I'm sure that they didn't realize. Lawson later departed from his moderate stance when Houston civic leaders continued to resist the pressure of the black activists. Eventually, he and other black leaders persisted as they worked with Houston's white business community behind closed doors to quietly integrate the city under a media blackout. As the African American community in the Third Ward began to see Lawson as a religious and community leader, they approached him to start a church near Texas Southern. He gathered 30 to 40 initial members from a recently formed congregation and established what became Wheeler Avenue Baptist Church. Lawson's relationships with the Union Baptist Association also led to a building for his newly formed church in 1962. And during the 3 years that Lawson was both the pastor at Wheeler Avenue and the director of the Baptist Student Union, proved pretty tumultuous for the young pastor. His position as a minister, as a growing political force, and as a student leader led to increased opportunities for him to mobilize for conscience and use his resources in the black community's benefit. As the civil rights movement intensified in Houston, activists targeted the institutional expressions of racism and inequality in Houston. For the Bayou City, this was the public school system. Many in the black community were dissatisfied with the slow and lack thereof progress of school desegregation by the mid-1960s. Although HISD had made a desegregation plan to comply with Brown v. Board by desegregating one grade a year beginning in 1960, there had only been token desegregation. And what little had occurred has still forced students and families of color to shoulder most of the burden. In May of 1965, leading up to the 10th anniversary of Brown II, which had ordered schools to desegregate with all deliberate speed, William Lawson, along with others in the NAACP in Houston and the Harris County Council of Negro Organizations, formed what they called an ad hoc organization called People for the Upgrading of Schools in Houston, or PUSH. They planned to organize a protest march that would demand for all Houston schools to desegregate completely and immediately, and for the district to begin to accept federal aid. Lawson, who had recently joined the NAACP, said in a statement about the march, "We will be calling for an end to school segregation at both faculty and student levels, and the establishment of one good system and the end of two mediocre ones." PUSH leaders decided that Lawson and 4 others would gather a crowd of people for a march on May 10th, which would begin at the South Central YMCA near Lawson's church. On the day of the march, Lawson had gathered about 90% of the black high school students in the area and other supporters inside the YMCA. But the other leaders had not gathered any more supporters. After a moment of hesitation where they thought, maybe we're not going to do this, Lawson led the students from the YMCA toward HISD headquarters in downtown Houston. Along the way, passers-by joined the students so that by the time they reached their destination, their crowd had grown to over 1,000. In predictable fashion, though, Superintendent John McFarland closed the district office and refused to meet with the marchers, although he did eventually schedule a meeting to hear PUSH representatives' concerns. Even though HISD continued to drag its feet to desegregate schools, the march itself drew more attention to what was becoming one of the nation's largest public school systems. Behind Lawson's leadership, PUSH held several more rallies and continued to pressure school district leaders to come up with a plan that would remove the barriers restricting opportunities for students of color. HISD stalled the process by offering what Lawson kept calling bones of tokenism. Thanks to PUSH, demonstrations, and the continued pressure by Lawson and others on city leaders, HISD finally voted the following June to completely desegregate by the fall of 1967. Of course, there's more to this story. Even after desegregation and the end of PUSH, Lawson has continued to lead campaigns as an advocate for equal opportunities and quality in education for black students. For Lawson, then, the civil rights movement created the conditions for his leadership, where he used his success, his access to the BSU, Wheeler Avenue Baptist Church, and Union Baptist Association to support civil rights activities and organize campaigns to pressure white leaders in business and education to change. So in the midst of intensifying civil rights movements throughout the country, Houston activists brought the issue of desegregation directly to one of the city's largest churches. At the end of the Sunday morning service on May 19th, 1963, at downtown Houston's First Baptist Church, this is what it looked like back then, a young African-American student associated with the local chapter of the Congress of Racial Equality, named Don Henderson, walked to the front of the all-white church to seek membership at the city's most conspicuous symbol of racial hypocrisy. At the time, FBC Houston's pastor, K. Owen White, was the president of both the Baptist General Convention of Texas and the larger regional convention, the Southern Baptist Convention. The church's downtown location, its segregationist policies, and White's high profile made First Baptist a prime target to pressure Southern white churches to face the moral dissonance in their persisting policies of exclusion and segregation. So after Henderson made his way forward, White decided to refer the issue of black membership to the deacons of accepting him immediately as a member of the church. White counseled with Henderson privately over several meetings. He learned of Henderson's association with CORE and made it known to the deacons. The deacons met 3 weeks later and rejected Henderson's membership bid because they felt that he had what they called selfish motives for joining. In response, CORE gave White and his church an ultimatum. They said, unless Negroes were admitted as members, we will picket the church, stage kneel-ins, and pack the pews with Negroes. To root out what they considered insincerity, White and his church instituted a screening committee, which would examine every new candidate's salvation experience, motivation, and former church experience, regardless of his or her race. When FBC Houston turned away other black membership candidates, CORE representatives arrived at the church with picket signs in hand the following Sunday on July 28th. The signs read, "How can a Christian church be segregated? And respect for human dignity is all we ask." White made a statement the following September that he would still not consider an African American for membership as long as CORE kept up what he called pressure tactics, because, as he said, there can be a wrong time to do a right thing. The summer of 1963 was certainly not the last time FBC Houston and other Baptist churches confronted the racism of their own institutions. In fact, that summer was merely a foreshadowing of things to come. Kaylin White personally felt that racial barriers had no place in a Christian church, but his hands were relatively tied as the pastor of a democratic autonomous Baptist church. In a denomination without an ecclesiastical hierarchy, Baptist pastors often walked a precarious line between conscience and action in times of social change. Socially conscious pastors had to find a way to press their churches to respond to moral conscience without losing the support of the congregation. Nevertheless, White stubbornly refused to budge or move his church to do so because he felt that people outside of the church were forcing them. In April of 1965, after the pressure from CORE had died down, an older African-American woman asked to join the church. White met with her and found her motives to be sincere. He felt that this woman's arrival represented the right time to change the church's policy. After White recommended her for membership, the deacons decided the church should vote on the issue on April 21st, 1965. In advance of the meeting, segregationist members of the church rallied as many people as possible to show up for the Wednesday night meeting, and by a vote of 206 to 182, church members voted not to accept, quote, members of the colored race. However, in a press conference following the vote, White told reporters that he felt the negative vote did not, quote, reflect the true spirit of the church. And there's a lot more to this story, and he talks about it many times, but in members of the church in the 60s look back and they remember seeing people at the church that night that they hadn't seen in like 20 years because there had been such a hard campaign to make sure that the vote came out the way they wanted it to. So as the drama at FBC Houston played out, Union Baptist Association, which included Houston's First Baptist Church, began working in earnest to create new lines of communication with Baptists of color. Just after picketing began at FBC Houston, UBA formed the Race Relations Committee, which immediately began meeting with representatives of the Houston Ministers Association, the local Black Pastors Conference. During their meetings, pastors exchanged literature, discussed areas of possible collaboration, and took tentative steps toward finding common ground. These small meetings evolved into something more formal and significant in 1965 as the Race Relations Committee organized official joint meetings between the black pastors of Houston's Ministers Association and white pastors of the Houston Baptist Pastors Conference. Collaboration of the following 3 years led to the formation of an interracial Baptist Pastors Alliance, the Harris County Baptist Ministers Fellowship. The Harris County Baptist Ministers Fellowship also included several Mexican-American Baptists, and their involvement in the organization increased steadily as the decade ended. Yet Anglo-Baptist relationship with Mexican Americans often remained beyond the vision of Baptists working toward racial healing. Yet the issue that forced Union Baptists to confront racial inequality for Mexican Americans occurred about 350 miles to the south of Houston, when James L. Navarro, a Mexican American Southern Baptist minister from Houston, helped lead a march from the Rio Grande Valley to Austin in the summer of 1966. James Lavois Navarro, a Mexican-American Baptist pastor, arrived in Houston in 1938 to lead Second Mexican Baptist Church in Magnolia Park. Within 7 years, he had established 2 other churches and founded a mission. After transitioning to the post of Union Baptist Association missionary to Spanish-speaking Houstonians, he expanded Mexican Baptist evangelism in Greater Houston to unprecedented heights. He also established the first Spanish-language Baptist radio program, La Hora Batista, on KLVL in Pasadena. Then in 1954 and 55, Navarro gained significant attention for single-handedly organizing 2 relief drives for flood and hurricane victims in the Rio Grande Valley and in Tamaulipas, Mexico. Using his access to KLVL, Navarro urged listeners to donate food, clothing, and supplies, which he arranged to deliver to areas in need. The following 2 decades, though, changed the way Navarro understood working within a system that ignored him and other Mexican Americans. The civil rights movement led him to apply his considerable religious energy and resources to political concerns. By the 1950s, Navarro had already joined several Mexican American civil rights organizations while still leading several churches at once. In the 1960s, Navarro pursued increasingly political roles in civil rights organizations and in local government. He had served as a local chaplain of LULAC in the 50s and became a statewide chaplain for PASO after the group formed in the 1960s. Navarro also worked on several other LULAC committees and helped establish LULAC's Houston Jobs for Progress Center. This program later developed into a joint operation with LULAC, the American GI Forum, and the EEOC called Operation SIR Jobs for Progress Incorporated. Navarro chaired the job placement program in Houston for several years and used his access to the radio program to help connect potential employers to individuals looking for work. But the event that put Navarro in the spotlight was his co-leadership of La Marcha, the 1966 minimum wage march from the Rio Grande Valley to Austin in protest of substandard wages and working conditions for farm workers. The march developed from a melon picker strike in Starr County, which began on June 1st, 1966. After nearly a month of picketing and conflict with growers, the Texas Rangers, the strike had garnered considerable attention. Among concerned Texans who went south to help was James Navarro. While there, he and other supporters representing PASO planned a 490-mile, 2-month trek from the valley to Austin, because they believed that the solution to their problem could be found at the seat of state government. Ultimately, the marchers hoped that their efforts would lead to a $1.25 minimum wage bill in Texas that would also include farm workers. And in a lot of the pictures about this event, you see marchers just like this, and they're leading a donkey who's named $1.25. So if you ever see these pictures, that's why. Among those marching in solidarity with the farm workers was another religious leader, Catholic priest Antonio Gonzalez. Not long after the march began, Gonzalez's diocese ordered him to stay behind until they could reach a decision about what his presence would mean for the church's support of a labor movement. In his absence, Navarro agreed to hold Gonzalez's crucifix along with his own American, Texas, and Christian flags. And I'll take you back a picture. So Gonzalez isn't in this picture, and you can already see that Navarro is holding the cross in his left hand, and then you can see all of his other flags in his right hand. Gonzalez is pictured there in the middle on the top. So when the marchers reached Corpus Christi, and this is what's in the newspaper clipping, at the beginning of August, newspaper and television reporters captured Navarro, crucifix in hand, leading the march. Navarro's apparent embrace of the Catholic Church during the march angered and alienated Texas Baptists along the way. Protestant support of the march was minimal beyond aid and support from the Texas Council of Churches. For their part, Baptists opted not to get involved in the march or in TCC activities because of their refusal to participate in ecumenicalism of any kind, and because Baptists, as they felt, were represented on both sides of the labor conflict. In spite of Navarro's long history as a leader in his churches and association, the publicity he garnered while leading the march cost him his church and his standing with Union Baptist. When he returned from the march, Union Baptist leaders called a meeting to discuss Navarro's future with the association. They asked him to agree to several conditions or they would remove him from the association. He had to agree to never march again, resign as chaplain of LULAC and Paso, and then cease participating in any other political organizations in the future, sort of a tall order. Since, as Navarro put it, they were asking him to, quote, go against the very thing that I was supposed to do in serving my people. So he refused their conditions. Therefore, Union voted to dismiss him from the association, which contributed to the loss of his congregation as well. After Navarro's fallout with the local Baptist Association, he turned the greater part of his time and resources toward political activism. He continued to work with LULAC, with the Jobs for Progress Incorporated. He continued to connect Mexican Americans with job training and placement. He also purchased a bilingual community newspaper, El Sol, which featured regular news coverage in both English and Spanish of events related to Mexican Americans in the area. Navarro infused all of the stories and features with his religious perspective, especially his weekly editorials. Navarro also used the paper to promote himself and other Mexican Americans for political office. Each year following the march until 1970, Navarro organized a commemorative reenactment of the event as a way to continue to press political leaders in Texas to hear and care about the concerns of Mexican Americans. He also used the moments as opportunities to remain involved in the Chicano movement in Texas and attempted even at one point to alter the direction of political support, going as far as declaring political independence on behalf of all Mexican Americans from all political parties. He even at one point called himself the grandfather of La Raza Unida. Some of his later activities are actually kind of, it begins to appear uncomfortable as it seems like he can't decide if he's too old to be involved or if he's allowed to be involved in the Baptist church or whatever. It's really interesting. So Navarro's experience, along with those of the other pastors examined here, highlight just some of the ways that the civil rights movement influenced African American, Anglo, and Latino Baptists in the Bayou City. For all three groups, the movement elevated social concerns within churches and moved religious activism into the community. For Lawson, the movement thrust him into a position of leadership where he used his access to the BSU and later Wheeler Avenue Baptist Church to support civil rights activities and organize campaigns to pressure the white establishment. For Cayo and White, the civil rights movement brought social concerns right to the doorsteps of his prominent church. Although he initially retreated from the opportunity to push his congregation in a positive direction, he eventually came around on the issue, but failed to mobilize his church to follow him. For James Navarro, the tumultuous decades surrounding the civil rights movement transformed Navarro from a primarily religious figure into one that was primarily political. Exploring these intersections of both race and religion along lines of class and gender, and extending the bounds of this study temporally and geographically, helps reveal even more ways that being Baptist changed what it meant to be African American, Anglo, or Latino in Houston. Thank you.